Right, recording. Right, Mmusi, thank you so much for chatting again and for your time. It's great speaking again. Yeah, you've walked an interesting journey in South Africa, Mmusi. I mean, we know that you've been a pastor in a church and involved in ministry, and then from there jumping into politics and eventually becoming leader of the opposition. Yeah, it's been a very interesting journey. If you could share a little bit on that. But there's one thing I think, there's actually, I think, three burning questions on the hearts of many Christians and people in South Africa. And the one is, in this journey, how have you reconciled your biblical convictions and being leader of a liberal party such as the DA?
Firstly, thank you so much for having me, and I send you incredible greetings from our family, and love God, love the work that you do, and I want to encourage you just to keep being faithful in what you're doing. And as we keep wanting to serve our nation, you know, I was preaching at a local church and felt God asked me to say there's a young person in here who has a deep call into politics. Part of the difficulty that I used to find at the time was that we used to tell people that politics is such a dirty sport, it should be left for politicians. And I couldn't reconcile in my head and in my spirit why God would use men and women like Joseph, Daniel, who were the politicians of the day. These were people who knew economic plans, who understood kingdom and being able to lead and rule. In a societies where many of them had pagan worship, there was a diversity of beliefs. And yet here were people who felt called into that space to bring kingdom, to bring rulership, and to set up nations. And so when I called that day for that young person and no person responded, my wife then said to me, I think that that young person was you. So my entry and foray into politics truly has emerged out of indeed a call of saying, God, you've called me into this space. The second thing is that I don't see politics in that sense as a less than spiritual area. I see it as a fairly spiritual place upon which godly principles and what God's call is must be brought on the earth. We live in a country where there were, at the time, I served within the ANC itself. I'd grown up in Soweto, so our politics had been there. I felt the DA at the time was a party that was very astute at delivering services for the poor. So if you like, a burning bush moment for me, a bit like Moses, was a moment where I sat with a woman who was digging a hole in her garden to build her own toilet. I said, that can't be right. I'm going to respond to that. And I feel this call to politics. And so the first call wasn't to the institution of politics. It was truly to service. It was truly to provide leadership to our country in the way that I felt God had called me to. And my joining into the DA wasn't because I felt there was a deep appeal to liberalism in that sense. And I think that term has had its own challenges, as has terms like socialism, as has all of those terms, because I think, and I can go into that on another day, but I went in there because I truly believed we needed to do something about provision of services for the poor. Because my call into politics about how do we build a nation, how do we restore a nation, and how do we make sure that there's shared prosperity for everybody. So I didn't, when I leave our church on a Sunday morning after having preached and felt I was arriving in Parliament on a Tuesday, that I was suddenly switching on something and switching off another thing. I felt God had called me to serve, and it was the same spiritual. I've seen God operate in both contexts. I've seen his favor on both contexts. And so for me, my journey into politics has been a very deeply spiritual one. And navigating that journey into the DA has given me privileges and it's given me challenges. I don't think these are challenges that are different to anyone who'd walk into a business that had different people with different beliefs inside the business. And the leadership of the DA also had different beliefs and different activities within it. But I was very clear in my head that I was here to serve and I really believe the future of leadership is spiritual. You've got to tap into what you feel God has called you to do and serve in that. And so, yes, in the party, there were Muslim people, there were people who didn't share common faiths, there were gay people, there were a whole diversity of people. But my basic call was that leadership's about service. And I truly believe that that's the grace that God places on people who are called into government, because I think kings are not called to rule over just Christians. They're called to give leadership, service to a nation. And in a nation, you must recognize that everyone there might have different beliefs, might have different orientations. Yours is to serve.
Mmusi, very often within the liberal discussions or discussion is about liberalism and liberal views are the gay issue. So maybe, can you share a little bit what's your personal views on gay marriage and maybe also on abortion, because that's also a sensitive issue for many Christians.
I think more crucially, I can remember just walking into a caucus of the DA at the time. And, in my heart of hearts, I walked in having come from a faith and a belief and still hold the belief that gay lifestyle is a sin. And it's not a special category of sin. So I don't necessarily believe when people say this sin is greater than that one, because actually I think when you do that, you fail the redemptive purpose of God within any life and any sin. I think the only judging point, the only judgment point that we all have that God places is who are we in relation to the person of Jesus? And that's the question. That's the only question on the table. God doesn't say, well, for this category of sinner and that category of sinner, what is the redemptive exercise here? At the cross, all sin is the same, and all of us have to relate in response to our relationship with Jesus. And the second bit is this, and I say this in practice. I walked into a caucus meeting, and the chairperson of the caucus was a gay South African who, when I arrived, I said, I want you to know, this is where I come from. This is where you come from. But I have a God who's gracious, who loves us both. And I want you to know that I'm willing to hear you, love you, journey with you. And he saw in me a Christian who was willing to say, how do I walk with you? I felt like it was like the woman at the well, or it was the woman caught in the very act. It was that same thing, because I too am a sinner. So when I sat with him, we journeyed together. And I'll never forget that even though he knew all the way through the end, this was well within a DA caucus, he knew all the way through the end where I felt as a believer, as one who stood on the fact that I felt that was, that he had the conviction to say, but you love me enough and I'll invite you to our civil union. Which brings me to the second point, which is this, that I really believe that given the South African Constitution, given where it is, I think that the Constitution puts civil union on the table, and I think that's appropriate. I think marriage is by design something God has made for a man and a woman. And therefore, I do think from where I sit, my conviction is to love, is to be willing to journey. And I think for many gay South Africans, know in their hearts that they would agree with a position that says, we recognize that our lifestyle is this, but we're gracious enough that you love us. And I really do think it's the goodness of God that leads all men unto repentance. And so from my journey, so to answer to your second question, I certainly think that there are constitutional provisions in this matter. I don't really believe that it should be amended to move on to the space of marriage. And I think we're Christians, Christian ministers, all of that, feel that that's no one would obligate them in the government to perform a ceremony where they would marry citizens of similar gender. And I certainly, as I sit here today, think that given the constitutional framework and given the biblical framework, I think it is correct that a marriage remains between a husband and a wife, and that a civil union be a provision that people can enter into.
And Mmusi, on the abortion issue?
Yeah. You know, as a father of 3 kids, I've known without a doubt that termination of pregnancy is not something that at a personal level I support. I certainly think that it's wrong. I think that we must recognize the fact that as a choice to exercise, God places before us life and death. I choose life. And that's the position I take. I recognize without doubt that as Christians, and this is my challenge even here on this conversation, we need to care about both the child in the womb and the child out the womb.
Yes.
I believe all of life is valuable. That's why sometimes I find it fascinating that if you want to be consistent on all of life issues, there's life in the womb, there's life out the womb, there's the value of life in general. And here's where my theology comes from, really. I think that if you look at the 10 commandments, and you look at the particular one on do not murder, before we look at it as a function of what is going on, let's reflect on why the children of Israel arrive at the 10 commandments. They arrived there historically because as slaves, they were taught into a universe of social Darwinianism, which said, let the strongest survive and let the weakest die. So if that is your framing of your belief, okay, when God introduces a new way of life, and he introduces the idea of not murdering, it's not just taking one's life, but it is the esteem of life. That all of life is equal. All of life is important. That you can't, because there are other people who will say, fine, if the weakest is in the womb, it must be true also for the disabled. It must be true also for the criminal who commits the most heinous crime. Therefore, life can be differentiated, whereas I come from the fact that all of life is God's life. And therefore, within that context, I would argue strongly that we need to protect all of life from conception to its eternal end. It is a fundamental belief I hold. And that's why for me, I will restore the dignity, I will uphold the right for people to choose life, and I will always fight to say that as we journey, if we really are kingdom ambassadors, we need to uphold all of life in general and understand it. Now, I know this has been a raging debate globally as to this notion of pro-choice, etc. I understand that. I get that, and I get placing before us life and death. I get that. And I get where our constitution, emanating from the judgment that took place about the preservation of life, I certainly think as believers and as a personal individual, it's something that I would oppose, and it's something that I stand to say, let's protect all of life, both in the womb and out the womb.
Mmusi, before I ask the last question, maybe just, I mean, this is the burning issue or question that many Christians have. So if these are your personal convictions, I mean, how difficult was it then to lead the DA when that party espouses almost the opposite? There must have been some internal, conflict within you. Or how did you deal with it? It is a difficult thing, or it was.
Yeah, look, in truth, and this is the next part I think I need to, when you get into government, okay, particularly at the level that we had to deal with. Remember when I was leader of the DA, we inherited 4 metros, which meant that in our administration, we were now administering over 160 billion rands just in the fiscus itself. And we had more public reps than we've ever had before. To be honest with you, just like this issue, South Africans sit at home and what they ask of you is that, are you going to give me an economy that works for me, that lets me have a job? Are you going to help me sleep better at night, not fear criminals? Are you going to help me get educated? Are you going to help me actually have a state that works? Are you going to infuse values into society that makes your families work well together? So what I found is that the majority of my time, and it still is, the wars that were taking place in public, few and seldom times were about the very respective issues that, in my view, are moral issues. I accept that they are important issues. But for many citizens at home, the debate often was about, do I eat, do I work, do I do all of it? So from a leadership point of view, it made it important that we had to share a vision about where this country needed to go. And that's something I've always fought for and will continue to fight for. Because I think sometimes when it comes to a narrow view of Christians in public life, they tend to think that all we worry about is just these issues. But actually we don't. This is one component of what we deal with, but we deal with a vision for more. I look at people like Joseph, and I think he produced an economic plan for a pagan nation. God was faithful in that. When I look at Moses, he fought in a slave environment against a pagan king, or like an unbelieving king, and brought freedom into that. When I look at people like David, I look at people like Daniel, who operated within a system, but eventually had to give leadership so that as through his leadership and testimony, even unbelievers would say, truly your God is an incredible God. So for me, I've always held this deep conviction that when you lead, and all of people, gay, black, white, whatever the differences are blessed because of your leadership, they will bow the knee and say, truly your God is an incredible God. That for me is the testimony I would want my life to leave behind. So when you say was it difficult? Yeah, there were very sticky issues. There were very difficult issues from time to time. But I also was always conscious of the fact that even a Muslim South African in the caucus would find issues within the organization itself that were hard to navigate through. And therefore, would always, when it came to issues that were moral in that sense, let us give everybody the right to exercise their choice as individuals. You don't have to ask them to vote collectively. So it's an easy one to say, because when you enter into public leadership, you lead everybody. And you've got to lead them to, there was a time where people would criticize me to say, you are married to a white woman. That's wrong. There were Christians who told us that what we are doing, they should not even come to our wedding. Now we could sit back and say, oh, well, we just can't, but we needed to recognize that we felt a deep conviction for it. There were times where people would find me. I remember preaching once at our church to say, some of my friends, whilst I stand strong that their lifestyle is not consistent with a biblical worldview, and yet they still remain my friends, people would say, how dare you? And I say, but don't I serve a Jesus who's a friend of sinners? I get deeply emotional about it. It's like it's a friend of sinners. Like and so why am I fighting in the world? I'm fighting for justice, because at the end of the day, that's what we're about. So when I look at it, which political party, now to the earlier question, when we talk liberalism, when we talk capitalism, when we talk socialism, when we talk Marxism, all of these isms and ideologies have failed. People have come to criticize them. You can say, maybe I'm a capitalist, but I go, well, as a capitalist, let's recognize this, that in fact, in some ways, there are capital aspects that are good, that allows people to trade, but then there's extractive of profit that makes it such that it benefits a few at the expense of the many. Then the others will say, let's all be socialists. I say, well, when an equal distribution of wealth doesn't always achieve the outcomes we want to achieve. And there's a beautiful book written about the wealth and poverty of nations that then asks this question: how do we prosper the nation collectively? And so for me, when I look at my economic point of view, I truly believe there is another way. There is another way. And that way says, so how do I define, in some ways, liberty? So not liberalism, which could be other things, maybe the worship of that, but liberty. Can I give you the right to worship? Can I give you the freedom to choose, the freedom to live where you want to live, the freedom to uphold your own dignity? Those things we must support. Is that liberalism? No, I think there are biblical values that allow you to have an identity as an individual, that lets you express that identity, that lets you be able to go, I will serve in this way. Now, if I say, then we must all look after the poor, does that mean I'm advancing socialism, or I'm responding to a biblical outlook of an economic model? I am. So even inside the DA, and there were people who would say, but this guy is not DA enough. And then there would be others who say, he's now being too DA. And sometimes I find even in the Christian community, sometimes people are going, you are never Christian enough. And then there are others who are too Christian. You are going to find that. But that's not for me to almost please men. I will stand before God one day and account. And I think the questions I'll have to respond to is not only which values I fought for, but did I serve people on the earth? Was I able to bring about an economy that benefits everybody? Was I able to serve? Did I do justice? Did I bring about that sense of what God had called me to do? And the last thing I'll say, and I know I've spent quite a bit of time on this issue, but I can remember being in Israel and Palestine, which is in some ways the very dividing issue sometimes within the DA, because now you've got Muslim South Africans who maybe, stand on one side of the debate. You've got Christian South Africans who stand on the other side of the debate. And when you've been to both and been willing to hear both, you can stand up and maybe advance a two-state solution, all of that. But the only thing I took away from that trip, after all the criticism, after all of that, is that all you have as a leader is your convictions. And if you hold on to your convictions and lead through those, even when it's tough, people have a reason to follow you. It's when you do what is polling, what is popular, and you say, well, what did the polls say? What are the people? The people wanted a king. So, the people want so many things, but you've got to stick true to your principle and walk with it. So Arno, I think the answer to your question is, I walked a journey of faith. I'll give you one last example. A lot of people here, maybe on this platform, would say, where did it matter that you had to choose? There was a time where I had to be at a march. That was a Stop Zuma march or something. And someone had been invited to preach in Australia at a conference. And many people would have heard that sermon about John 2, about God turning water into wine and how nations are authored in heaven. And I remember I went to go preach there, which meant that I missed the march. When I came back, there was a backlash to say, how dare you choose that? And we prayed about it. We were, how dare you choose that? That was inside the organization and it was a fight. But you can go on to Daystar's website maybe today. It's probably been one of the most viewed sermons I've ever preached in my life, which says to you, sometimes when you back what you believe God has called you to do, he blesses that, he anoints it, because that's who he is. That's
absolutely. Mmusi, can I maybe just ask this last question, because I think this will really help a lot of Christians and everybody, really. So Christians who often quote the Bible verses on the gay issue are very often accused of hate speech by liberals or whoever. This, while we know we don't hate gay people, we love them. What do you say to Bible-believing Christians who wants to express their freedom of religion on moral issues such as this?
Well, I want to encourage them. You need to stand strong on those convictions. The strength of our Constitution is that actually it gives you the freedom to express that. The weakness of our Constitution is that certain institutions that are meant to protect your freedom to say that are not always working well. And that's why we need people in public office who are going to start those institutions so that your freedoms of expression are always given out. But I would urge to say, be willing to stand up for what you believe, speak it out, stand up for it, because the Constitution that we have protects that right to do so. And so for me, what I would urge is that as people must hear us about that, they must also see our actions about love. Because sometimes I think we can speak a lot and stand up in public arguments about these things. But wouldn't it be amazing if the best adoption agencies were run by Christians? Wouldn't it be amazing if, in actual fact, we would be the first ones to love and to care? You know, think about it this way.
Yeah.
When you flip the coin on this issue, think about Gift of the Givers, which is a Muslim NGO, if I'm not mistaken. I see their work. And sometimes some of the things they say, I don't agree with. I don't agree with some of the position that even well within the faith, the positioning of women, etc., etc. I don't agree with. But you know what? I see their work, see what they do. So I'm asking us as Christians, do people see our work? You know, the end of apartheid was because Christians stood up. When I look at Zacchaeus, Jesus comes into his house, he says, I will repay back 4 times, which is addressing this issue of greed, but also addressing the ability to be able to go out and restore. So to me, let's speak, but let's act. Because when we do that, people know that there's congruence between our words and our actions. For me, it's the Jesus model. I saw him speak strongly against sin, but I saw him actually walk with a woman who was found in the very act. I saw him do that. So that's, to me, the actions that we need to demonstrate. So I would urge more seriously, it's time for the church to act. Because if we were acting more, we wouldn't be the only ones fighting for the church to be open during COVID. You'd have unbelievers fighting for the churches to be open because the church was acting. So I oppose this new hate crimes bill that they've put on the table. I think it's wrong. I think it's unconstitutional. I think it limits people's freedom of expression. And anyone who wants to preach from their text, no one can deny me the right to preach from the Bible. If they do that, that already is unconstitutional. So let the people preach, let the people speak, but we must demonstrate our love because I think when it's summed, that's where we will be known for it.
Absolutely. As much as we stand for truth, we must express love and draw people closer to be salt and light. Absolutely. Mmusi, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And you're an inspirational leader, and we keep praying for you because all of us need wisdom and we're learning as we go. And may the Lord's purposes fulfill in your life, in all of our lives. And as we play a key role in making a contribution to let this nation fulfill its redemptive purpose for God's glory. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, my brother. I'll speak to you soon. God bless you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Alan.